we are bottom of the Smash Mountain. I'm very, very pleased to introduce someone who is in the higher echelon of esports. I think just to put this as plainly as I can, TSM FTX, one of the premier esports organizations in the entire world, and this is the vice president of the esports division. This is TSM FTX Dominic. I'm also joined here by Ventus official. I'm sorry, I'm not going to give you as fancy of an intro, Ventus, but I'm really pleased to have you on because you suggested that I go for this, that we have Dominic onto the podcast. So Dominic, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, no, glad to be here. Thanks for having me on.
So I'll just go ahead and launch off with the first question, sort of an icebreaker. You spent time in the world of finance before getting into esports. You spent time over at Gen G, and in the beginning of this year announced your intention to join TSM. So I'm always curious about how viable the realm of esports is, and to a certain degree it can be very, very successful. Of course, TSM is a great example of that. Of course, there are also instances where esports can be just sort of the degenerate stuff where there's an organization trying to do good, but then it kind of falls into the weeds. Some esports are not very profitable, all that kind of stuff. And you come from a finance background, so you probably, safe to say, are very passionate about esports in general. But what else would have caused you to say, I can make this financially viable for myself, and I can also allow whoever I join and whoever I work for to succeed financially as well?
Yeah, definitely. So I definitely didn't come from the grassroots of esports, but from being in the finance ecosystem where I predominantly worked in private equity, which is, acquiring large private companies, cleaning them up, merging them together, and then selling them off to other companies. And while that was a lot of fun, that is a very, very different business model than esports, right? And so at the time, I was looking at a certain opportunity within video game design automation software, and we're looking at a few different companies in that industry. And that's where we basically saw the emergence, or I started to see the emergence of, sports and technology coming together as one. That was probably around 2014, 2015. And this is where you really started to see the heyday of esports start to rise to success, right? And I think this is also the heyday of TSM. And so throughout that whole process and throughout that whole initiative, we started to see ways where a younger audience was spending a bunch of their time playing video games. And when you have a large enough audience that is spending their time in one area, one sector, that's where marketers want to reach. And it's really, really hard to reach young audiences. And so that was probably around the time where I was like, oh, hey, this is where people are spending their time. This is where marketers are trying to reach. And that's where it becomes viable, right? When you have large marketing companies starting to spend millions and millions of dollars to market to this young audience, that's when you can create a successful industry or successful sort of cohort. And so that's why I thought it would be a great area to invest and spend my time. And that's kind of what led to the jump.
So you have a lot of different responsibilities that you already have your hands full with over at TSM. You're trying to get all the processes down. I heard that word a couple of different times, so I had to say it again here. You wanted to get all that kind of growing business stuff taken care of, make sure that there's things put together so that it's not just about, oh, well, hey, we're growing. Cool. We're doing awesome stuff. Cool. Paperwork. What's paperwork? And then you also want to be in the business of winning. That's a huge part of your responsibility and what you want to do with TSM. And so I look at something that's besides League, other high profile esports. And since I come from Smash, from Melee, from Ultimate as well, I'm curious what your perception is just as an outsider looking in, since you yourself, before we started recording here, you said, I don't have a ton of experience within Smash. I saw you on Stans, the Stans show, and Stans is connected to Ludwig, and Ludwig comes from Smash. So you know what the games are, but I'm just curious what your perspective is of that franchise.
Yeah, no, I'm a big fan of Stans and everything that he's doing. And, obviously he's even competed at a couple small tournaments here with Atrioc. And so want to support him on his initiatives wherever possible. I think Smash is really, really interesting because it's one of the few ecosystems within esports that's 100% fan and crowd driven, right? Like the publisher itself is actively trying to destroy the ecosystem. And will go out of its way to shut down tournaments, to shut down what is essentially free marketing of their game, because they want to see that their game played in a certain way with all the items on, or all these different features, which doesn't make the game competitive. But the community has found a way to make a game not only competitive, but then within the COVID area was able to create new technology so that you could play the game in a remote environment with Slippy, and be able to compete in that capacity as well, which I thought was freaking amazing. But now you're even seeing large tournament producers that have used to put on Melee, like Evo, basically say, hey, we're not even keeping that game alive, or we're not using that game anymore, which is really disappointing to see, right? So I think it's a really, really cool ecosystem. I love that it's 100% fan grown and fan driven. But it makes it also hard for large teams and publishers to invest a ton of money into the ecosystem when they actively know that the publisher is trying to destroy that ecosystem as a whole. And so I think you will see more people like Ludwig and Atrioc and people who reached other forms of success, not directly through Smash, try to support the ecosystem and keep it alive for as long as possible. And you see how it's even been, fundamental to the success of TSM with Leffen and with Tweak. There are large organizations out there who still find a lot of value in supporting the ecosystem, supporting the top players within that ecosystem, and having a high level of competition at its purest form.
That's amazing to me. Okay, so on both of the appearances that I watched you interview on, you're sort of, I think you're doing a great job of trying to answer questions, but also to be respectful of TSM, the players' relationships, trying to make sure not to overstep into any sort of, hey, we want to keep those kind of in-house conversations in-house. I'm not just going to spill everything out. And so there were some comments, or some people saying, you're kind of dodging questions, or however you want to phrase it. You just came out rather strongly just now. Not that that's not going to be the Twitter clip necessarily, but it's like, yeah, you're saying words like Slippy. What? You're saying that the publisher, Nintendo in this instance, is actively trying to disregard, destroy, undermine the workings of the grassroots Smash community, which is true. I mean, I say that all the time, but I wasn't ready for you to say that. Would you be willing to explain sort of the perspective of why you would, I don't know, want to call it like it is with that specifically? Is it because you already know, because of Tweak, because of Leffen, and talking with them, that is what it is? Or what would be the reasoning behind that? I'm just very curious.
Yeah, I think it's common knowledge within the ecosystem, right? Like, I think you even see with even the stage and the presentation of Ultimate this weekend, like, it really is grassroots. Everyone's sitting on a couch. Everyone's trying to help support each other. It's a group of guys going into a room and competing on the best basis that they can, where some of these other esports and ecosystems literally have full stages and publishers are coming and attending and all these sort of events. And I think it's just more of, it is what it is, right? And I believe that there are certain people within Nintendo that want to see the success of the Melee and Ultimate community, but they may not be in positions of power to be able to promote and support that ecosystem, right? And I think that's the same in a bunch of different esports. But I think we have all actively seen that ultimately I want to see Smash succeed, right? And I want to see like specifically Melee, right? Like, I want to see Melee still be around here in, another 20 years. The only way that's going to be kept alive is through grassroots and fan-led initiatives, right? And through people like Ludwig, right? And so I think there is much less concern of a publisher like Nintendo coming after me or coming after any of our players, if their main stance has already been to, stand on the side and ignore the community. Where I think in some other games, if you come out and smash the publisher or smash a player in the ecosystem, there's larger ramifications that can happen from that. Where in this sort of sense, like, we all want the Smash community to succeed, and it's just figuring out different ways to make that happen.
So from TSM's perspective, and this is kind of tying it back to profitability.
Yeah.
I think one thing that you see in the Melee scene, like Golden Guardians just had a big Melee initiative, and like GG Melee is like outpacing their viewership than like their LCS content and things like that.
Yep.
And not just games like Melee, but I do think Melee is like a fantastic example of this.
Yep.
I think it has an ecosystem where if you want to make a living in Melee because it is grassroots, or the game isn't, the publisher isn't pumping money into the scene, or not enough money to make it a full-time career, I think it incentivizes those players to become their own brands and personalities. Like, I mean, like GG Melee, when they picked up everyone, all those people are already they're already working on their own personal branding. And so on one hand, I think that's a huge upside for like a team to invest. On the other hand, you have the downside of like, okay, but the scene could be obliterated and then all that is for nothing.
Yeah.
But on the flip side, for like LCS or other leagues, I'm just curious on like, I find it hard to figure out how you get a return on investment in some things. It could be very long term.
Yeah.
But just balancing out like, okay, are we using them in content? And like, because I was really jaded and kind of am a little bit about esports and it being profitable. Yeah. I believe more into it now. And I was definitely jaded about TSM. I became unjaded after watching you on the Stand show. And the fact that you're doing shows like this and Hotline League I was like, oh my gosh, like esports needs this. But I guess my overall question is, especially focusing on profitability for things like League of Legends or Valorant, one, how much of the profitability is reliant on like being a like number 1 or 2 team? Like, do you think there's a world where if you're not a top team, you can still get some sort of positive return on investment?
Yeah.
And yeah, that's basically my question.
Yeah, I think to just give you a little bit of peek behind the curtain, every single esport has different levers and pulleys to make money, right? So for some games, that's going to be purely prize pool, right? Like, hey, I need to be the best at this game. There's no viewership here, but if we win every single tournament, we make a good amount of money, and that's great, right? Today, in today's day and age, esports orgs almost take 0% of prize pool. Almost all of that flows right back through the player, right? So then other ways of driving money is through sponsorship capabilities. And to tell you the truth, I think Stans has mentioned this on a show, sponsorship drives the majority of revenue within esports. So if you are a large brand and you are able to bring in large, powerful sponsors, you're more likely to be able to have the resources to go and do cool things, but also to be profitable, right? Well, you've seen a bunch of orgs out there that, have only, a G Fuel sponsorship and a chair sponsorship, and then throw that they're sponsored by Twitch, but it's just they have streamers on Twitch, right? Like, and that's their group. And to tell you the truth, there's some orgs that operate at a basis where that's all that they need, right? But for an org like TSM that has, large sponsorship groups and large sponsorship amounts from FTX, from Geico, from Logitech, that are long-term lasting sponsorships, these tend to be much larger deals, right? So that's probably where a big percent of money comes from. Other parts are from skin sales, right? And so that can be what was done in Valorant, where you make it the champions and they sell a skin, and then that gets split in between all teams. And so you've seen that across Rainbow Six, you've seen that across Apex, you've seen that across a bunch of different titles where skin sales that benefits teams. Same with PUBG, right? In some of these titles, there's leagues which will pay you stipends, right? For you having a team in that league, they will pay you a certain amount of money. And that's how Riot League of Legends used to do it way back in the day, right? Where they would basically pay each team a small amount of money so that you would stay in the ecosystem and you would build a team. Other ways are through streaming and media deals. So a lot of the large Chinese and LCK teams have large streaming deals there. TSM has has streaming deals. There's other teams here in North America that have streaming deals. What else? Content revenue through YouTube, right? So some of these large organizations have massive YouTube accounts, and when you run sponsorship dollars against that sort of thing, you can actually make pretty good money as an org from that sort of sense. Selling merch, even though it has very, very small margins, you can still sell large revenue amounts. Even if the margins on that are very small, you still get to recognize that revenue as revenue that it comes in. And then you're starting to see a lot of esports teams start to do strategic side businesses. So for Gen G, that was education and private school and teaching initiatives. There you have TSM with Blitz, and earlier on having other sort of pro teaching tools and websites and all that sort of capabilities. You have Fanatics selling hardware. You got 100 Thieves buying a keyboard brand and doing all that sort of stuff. So what I just told you right there is about 10 to 15 different ways that esports orgs can make money. Everyone's trying to figure out their own business model and figuring out ways to not only make revenue, but also make sure that that's profitable at the end of the day. Because guess what? You can sell 50 million in merch, but if it costs you 60 million to make all that merch, that's not the best business model, right? And so it's really thinking about that too, of what are the profit margins on all these different bases. And so thinking about that from an org where maybe you're a brand that I really love in the ecosystem is like Panda Global, right? Like they run a small ecosystem, but they know what they do. They're very good at it, and they sell good strategic sponsorships. And they don't sell them that, hey, we're the biggest esport in the world. They say, no, we're one of the best Smash and Melee brands in the ecosystem, but we also sell, I think they sell like a box and like controllers, and they sell other components within that ecosystem that makes sense for them, right? And so understanding also that every esports org also has different goals and ambitions of what level of success they're trying to reach.
It's crazy
Damn.
to me. You were talking about skins earlier. There's a Melee Fox skin that's TSM themed that somebody made for 11. They just did it for free.
Yeah.
But like, there's something that you just wouldn't have with a Nintendo title for Melee specifically. But those are so many different ideas in terms of ways for an esports org to bring in income. It doesn't always seem like it's necessarily viable. But I think that if you were to get into any other business, you would quickly discover, oh wait, it's hard to make money at first. You really have to. It's a bunch of different things. You have to get somebody who has a deep pocket to believe in you more often than not to at least start. But it's really, really cool to hear how you were able to perform well, be able to make positive differences at the organizations you were previously working at, and now at TSM. I noticed in the 2 interview pieces that I saw you participate in, the positive attitude that you put out. And this is something that resonates with me because I try really hard to do that with my podcast and interacting with people who are either just listening or engage on Twitter, wherever. So I'm just curious from your perspective, your positive attitude, of course, will carry you sometimes, but of course it's also about results. How much does it matter to you how you conduct yourself, not just in terms of a performing person, oh great, let's hire that person because they'll make our organization successful, but also about the interpersonal relationships?
Yeah, definitely. I think communication is one of the most important skills that you can develop as an individual, and it'll carry you in every aspect of life. And usually when you meet someone, you never know, shaking that person's hand, if that person is a CEO of a business or if it's someone who's working at a coffee shop. But guess what? That person who's working at a coffee shop could, within a few years, run and be a CEO of one of the most successful businesses in the world. So treating everyone with respect and being nice and kind to everyone, and understanding that everyone has something interesting to say, and for that you can learn something from everyone, will carry you far in life. And so that's something that I was sort of taught at a young age, and have kind of continued going forward. We're all going to run into rough days. We're all going to run into rough situations. But if you let that energy sort of feed onto other people that you interact with, or whether that's players, whether that's coaching, then you ruin someone else's day based on something that wasn't in their control, right? And so for me, it's like if I can always share a positive attitude and make people excited to work with me and excited about the initiatives that I'm working on and excited about the things that we're doing here internally, then that's likely to make someone's life better. And ultimately, that's what we want at the end of the day.
Ventus, what do you got?
Well, so speaking of doing things internally, on Hotline League, my specific call was basically what were the problems in esports and how is TSM addressing it?
Yeah.
And to what I got out of that call was basically like TSM currently feels more disjointed than it should be. Like things aren't lining up, or they're not synergizing as well as they could. And if it was synergizing better, like you'd just be way more efficient. Yeah. And I have a few friends in multiple esport orgs who have told me that similar things to like that is the problem they're tackling, which is crazy because I'm like, man, from an outside perspective, I think most fans assume that everything is running as efficiently as possible in esports.
Yeah.
So it is. And now it's like, oh, it really isn't. And so that's kind of optimistic because it's like, I can't wait for things to be better.
Yeah.
But with that in mind, I'm curious, what are some examples of what that actually looks like? And then also balancing like the corporate side of TSM with the esports side. And I don't know how investor heavy or like corporate TSM is, but like balancing those two sides of things where it's like, okay, we want to do this really professionally, or like where your background in finance and how the systems work there, which is a more professional field, to like the nitty gritty kind of like Wild West that esports is, but is like hurting because it isn't like doesn't have like good systems in place yet, and balancing those two things.
Totally. I think comes down to more of just an explanation of growth, right? So if you look at the very like initial kernel of esports, I look at something like Moist Critical, right? Like he is literally starting to build his own esports org, very similar to what Andy did back in 2011, 2014. But the issue now in 2022 is you have way more social media and visibility on that sort of stuff. So I think if I got things correct, like Most Critical will eventually like to build an esports org as big and as prominent as TSM, right? Eventually one day. And what happened with TSM is they were really at a point where they were growing with their small group of, I'd say 5 or 6 individuals, that was their only focus, right? Like TSM was the only focus, LCS was the only focus. And then as they started to grow and really get to a big enough point, you had multiple key members of that decision tree leave, and that causes a hole. And then you have other key members of that initial team start to focus on other things, right? Focus on Blitz, focus on other initiatives that are going here internally. So what you're actually looking within TSM is helping rebuild the group that's 100% focused on esports. And that is why I was brought in, right? Is to be 100% focused on that esports group, to then help start to bring a lot of these things under a single umbrella like it was before. And that change has been rough, right? Like it hasn't been a smooth transition like it is with say other changes or new eras, right? Like let's just be blunt and honest about that. But I think the hope here is that while we go through kind of this rebuilding process, I think we talked about this on stands and Hotline League a little bit, as I start to work on kind of fixing that and bringing that all together again here in 2022, I think you'll start to see more of an aligned message. But again, marketing and a lot of those initiatives were led by other people that have left the organization, right? And so when you're asking about like, hey, why does it look disjointed? It's like, oh, because we are hiring like a VP of marketing. If you look on our website, it's like, no, we need that person to come in to help with that storytelling and to help with that brand. Oh, Andrew just left because he used to be head of Legends that was done here for 7 years. Yeah, there was people on his team, but guess what? That probably needs to be filled and it's going to take time. And so a lot of these things of like a group of people leaving that have been here for such a long time and were part of that core initial group, transitioning to new people taking over that roles, it feels choppy and it feels like disjointed, to your point, right? But I think what you'll hopefully start to see here is, within another 6 months to a year, a lot of these storylines will start to come together, and it will seem more like the TSM of before, where you have a singular sort of group and a singular sort of message, and branding can be a little bit more aligned and that sort of stuff. Where right now it's a lot of people just covering for other people's holes that are within the org, and that's the same in any sort of company. But hats off to I'd say probably to 100 Thieves, who've done an amazing job, and John has built an amazing team there. But again, that is a little bit easier when the initial founding team that started 100 Thieves is still there throughout that whole process as you start to add more people onto it, instead of, hey, we built this product and now we're trying to change, we're trying to change an airplane engine while we're 10,000 feet up in the air. And so that's why it can feel a little bit awkward or weird compared to maybe what's going on at other esports orgs. But I think you've probably talked to your friends in the industry. You'll start to find out the grass isn't always greener on the other side, that almost every single one of these esports orgs is going through their own issues, through their own sort of, problems. And that's good. That means like we're all working on solutions. We're all trying to fix these things. We're trying to make it a good ecosystem for everyone involved. But it's hard. It's not easy. Running a business is not easy. And ultimately, at the end of the day, we're still living in this facade or this hype dream that any 15-year-old kid can basically have this dream that, screw it, I don't want to go and get a real life job. I just want to be in competitive esports. I want to be a content streamer, and I can be as big and as popular as Snoop Dogg, right? And so that's what the goal of all these esports orgs are trying to do and still help cultivate and create, is keeping that aesthetic that dream is still alive.
We are up against it in terms of time, so we want to be respectful of yours, Dominic. Thank you so much for joining me in Ventus. I'll just plug ourselves real quick. You can find me at Cypher003 and at BSM Pod for the podcast on Twitter. You can follow Ventus over at Remarkable Matt with 3 T's at the end. And then for you, Dominic, it is at Callous Dominic on Twitter. But is there any other place where you want the people to find you, or to where to support TSM FTX?
No, continue to check out the rest of Ventus's content and like and subscribe.
Really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you guys.
Thank you.